Now, the Russian news agency TASS is reporting that Dmitry Ivanov, the founder of an opposition social media channel, has been sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. He was reportedly charged with spreading fake news about Russia's military. In Russia, anyone perceived to have discredited the Russian army could already face a draconian prison sentence. The parliament has recently given initial backing to stepping up the law to cover fighters for the mercenary Wagner Group.
Anyone who criticizes Russian soldiers in Ukraine, whether they're fighting for the Russian army or so-called volunteer units, could soon face a long prison sentence. A law punishing public defaming of the military has been in place for a year now, but that's likely to be extended to include so-called volunteers or mercenaries.
Who are these volunteers that are mentioned in the same breath as Russian soldiers? It's not clear who they mean, and that worries me a lot.
The new law would cover private armies. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner mercenary group, wants the Russian parliament to add the term volunteers to the discreditation law. Many of Prigozhin's soldiers are former prisoners he personally recruited.
We need your criminal talents. I myself served 10 years in prison before I became a Russian hero. I have a few more talents now that help me a lot in life.
Lawyers complain that since the war began, the Russian parliament has passed a series of bills aimed at stifling dissent.
It's not just about the Wagner Group. I think the idea behind the amendment is to broaden the scope of law enforcement in general. Any criticism of military special operations will be punished.
Punishment under the new law would be draconian, up to 15 years in a penal colony.
From a legal point of view, this is simply absurd. Statements, even if it's just one sentence, or a single piece of information that is judged to be false, even though it's very likely to be correct. Such statements are given huge prison sentences. We haven't seen anything like this since the 1950s.
The new amendments have already been fast-tracked through Parliament. Later this month, they're set to be approved by the Upper House and signed into law by President Putin.
And now Yuri Resheto is DW's Moscow bureau chief. He's now based in the Latvian capital, Riga, because DW is banned in Russia. Yuri joining us now for more. Welcome to you. How hard could this new law hit critics of President Putin and his war policies?
Well, Sarah, since the first law on discrediting the army was introduced a year ago, almost 500 people have now been punished as criminals. One of the last cases, you mentioned it, is the founder of an opposition Telegram channel, Dmitry Ivanov. Today earlier, he was sentenced to more than 8 years in prison on charges of so-called spreading false information about Russia's armed forces. Almost 6,000 other people in Russia received the so-called administrative offense penalties, the first step before imprisonment or a large fine for a crime. So these are all people who are against the war. But apparently that's not enough for the Russian court system, for the Russian justice. And so this new law is about punishing as many people as possible, about intimidating a huge country in times of war.
The new law tightens the penalties for criticism of anyone who fights for Russia, as we've been hearing. That includes the mercenaries like the Wagner Group. What do we make of this, Yuri? Why this move now?
Well, look, Yeah, Wagner mercenaries play an important role at the front, and there is, let's call it a competition or even rivalry between the Russian army and Wagner's mercenaries. The head of Wagner, Evgeny Prigozhin, we saw it in my report, I saw him in my report, he has repeatedly complained publicly that his soldiers are not getting enough weapons and that his soldiers are not valued enough by the defense ministry, and the new law is basically nothing more than a favor to Prigozhin. This law prohibits negative opinions about volunteers, so private army fighters, so Prigozhin's people. But the paradox is that private armies in Russia are banned. And what's even more paradoxical, Sarah, is the fact that on the side of Prigozhin, thousands of prisoners are fighting, men who were sent directly from jail to the front lines. So considering how many concessions the Kremlin seems to be making to Prigozhin, his Wagner group, changing entire laws for him, you can imagine how important he is for the Kremlin.
How much support is there for Putin's war against Ukraine among the Russian population right now?
Yeah, the Russian authorities made the special military operation, as it's still called inside Russia, part of the official canon in all parts of the country's life. The authorities are much more straightforward than before in teaching Russians to be proud of the invasion. The Kremlin rewards officials and propagandists for so-called military successes, organizes events glorifying the so-called military operation, opens new monuments to the Russian military, and so on and so on. So ultimately, there is a part of society that is radically determined to continue the war by any means. But the vast majority of Russians have long been fed up with propaganda. They are simply trying to ignore it, knowing that protest is punishable, even more with the new law we are talking about.
Yuri Roshetto in Riga, thank you.